What is up guys, Blue Spooky here with a 2-hour Megamix. That is 2 hours of new true scary stories to this channel, as much as I'm able to track. If you guys enjoy this long video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. Doing all of those ensures I can keep making daily videos for a long time to come, especially these longer ones. If you guys have any thoughts about the stories in this video, please be sure to leave them in the comments below, as one of my favorite parts about doing this is reading your guys' comments, even if I don't always get the chance to reply to them. Without further ado though guys, I will let you enjoy the next 2 hours of true scary stories, and I will see you again at the end of the video. Thanks for watching. I finally feel ready to share my very creepy and uncomfortable encounter. This has been a few years since this happened, but to this day, I feel sick just thinking about that night. When I was in my very early 20s or so, I lived in some pretty shitty apartments. Pretty cheap too because of this. They were known for being a little bit sketchy for the area even. There was this one neighbor that seemed to be listening to James Brown and Motown, so even though he seemed a bit off, I thought to myself, how weird could he be? He's chilling to some really classic old music, surely he can't be that bad a guy. I'd hear him blasting his music and having loud conversations through the walls, but then again, we both had studio apartments that were touching. I would just play my own music to not hear his stuff so loudly. One night he was drinking quite a lot. He seemed to have his girlfriend around or something. You could hear them being belligerent, but nothing that seemed out of the ordinary, at least for him I suppose. It wasn't too late yet, so I headed out for the night with some friends, while my boyfriend at the time stayed in. I got dropped off around 1 a.m. or so. As we were driving into the lot, from afar I could see my neighbor outside, looking like he was hiding in between some cars in the apartment or something. Okay, that was pretty weird. Whatever though, this guy was just kinda creepy anyways. At that point, my friends were more weirded out than I was actually. I didn't think that much of it. This guy was always doing some weird shit. I had one of them drop me off near the entrance because it was easier for them to leave that way. That was until they started to drive away. I walked up to go into my apartment, which I had to pass by his first. I swear my heart dropped out of my chest. I noticed he was still standing by them, but now his body was hidden behind the bush that was in between our apartments. As I approached, it seemed like he thought maybe I hadn't seen him yet because it was so dark out. He was standing as still as a statue, like he was trying not to be seen. I waved and mumbled hi to let him know he wasn't fooling anyone. I was not going to pretend at this point I couldn't see him. I didn't want him to try anything, since no one was out on a weekday at this hour. At that point, after acknowledging he was there, he stepped out from behind the bush and came into the dim porch light. Never in my life have I locked onto someone's eyes like that. My heart's racing even as I typed this. His eyes were widened, dark, and fully dilated like he was just a wild animal. He looked like an absolute lunatic, if I were to express his energy well. He didn't say anything, but he gave me the most bone-chilling look. I ran into my apartment as fast as possible. My boyfriend was drowsy since it was late, but he did say the neighbor's music was loud and continued for some time. He heard a lot of noise and arguing earlier, but he hadn't really thought that much of it. That night, all night, we heard thumps coming from his apartment, and it also sounded like furniture was being moved. It weirded me out, knowing he was still awake and in that crazed state I'd viewed him in, almost primal. The next morning, I heard cops banging on his door and was partially relieved to see them. I was also super scared to see why they were there in the first place. They took him away in handcuffs shortly after, demanding to be let in. They asked me when the last time I had talked to him or seen him was. I told them about that night. The arguing, the noises, the frightening encounter, the thumping all night. What I found out during the next day will make my stomach turn forever. I was told this from the groundskeeper. Details I'll keep more simple since the act was so horrendous. The Motown James Brown listening neighbor brutally murdered his girlfriend that night, dismembered parts of her, and dragged the rest of her body near the train tracks, which so happened to be directly behind our apartment. It hit me that the cold, primal, and wide-eyed look I'd seen in that man was the look of a person who'd just taken another human being's life and was worried I'd noticed he'd done it, in such a vicious and disgusting way, too. I felt so sad for that woman, who definitely did not deserve to go like that. She was always quiet and so sweet, and seemed a bit down on her luck. She was always asking for cigarettes whenever I encountered her. To this day, my stomach turns, thinking about how close I was to death, quite literally. He could have ambushed me out of insanity, since he was just waiting in the darkness when I walked up. Basically, to all of you who follow their intuition and gut feeling, listen to it. If you have a bad feeling about someone, even if they seem completely harmless, just stay a safe distance and be wary of them. I moved into a different apartment right after. It was just too much thinking about what happened that night. That neighbor went to jail, of course. I saw his booking photo, where he looked even more scary. I just hope he stays in jail for a long time, where he truly belongs. After listening through some human trafficking stories elsewhere, I can't help but feel incredibly uneasy. My heart is racing at the thought of what we might have avoided. Stay vigilant, both men and women. For reference, my boyfriend is about 6'3" and 275/300 pounds. He's very stocky and has a military style. He used to be in the military. Usually he just wears a shirt with some guns on it in some way and has a very thick beard. This is somewhat important for the story, actually. About 3 years ago, my boyfriend and I moved into a house with a couple of roommates near downtown in a big city of Michigan. I had sent him to the store for some staples while I started unpacking. He texted me just after arriving, saying he had the weirdest thing happen in the parking lot, but he would tell me when he got home. 10 minutes later, he texted again, saying he was super creeped out, and jokingly told me, "If I'm not on my way in 5 minutes, please send help." This was normal for his kind of humor. When he got home, he told me that on his way in from the parking lot, a man had stopped him offering several compliments on his beard. It happened quite a bit from guys, so he didn't really think that much of it at first. The man seemed to be dressed as if he were a lawyer or a real estate agent or something. Nice shoes, nice watch, very clean cut. He didn't seem suspicious at all. My boyfriend said thanks and began to walk inside. The guy continued walking with him, asking all those questions, where he was from, what he did for a living, if he had kids or a wife. His gut lit up like fireworks, and after working in mental health for a bit, he knew to trust it. He made up some answers and told him to have a nice day. The man told him, "If you're ever interested in a new line of work, you're just the kind of guy we're looking for." My boyfriend continued walking without responding and didn't look back. Only a few minutes later, he noticed the same man was now in the store and was appearing in all the same aisles as him. Whenever my boyfriend would notice him, he would immediately turn around and go the other way. At one point, the point he texted me, he was sure the man was secretly snapping photos of him from the other end of an aisle. We both commented on this craziness and said, "That's some trafficking shit right there." We let it go though, as it was now over and no one really wanted to believe it. Days later, we ran to the store again to pick up some late night snacks. We parked the car what felt like miles from the store and began walking in. Thankfully, I don't really startle easily when we're out together because we both conceal carry, and if someone tried to attack us, we're decently prepared. Still though, I jumped when a man's voice suddenly yelled out my boyfriend's name and added, "And his pretty wife too." My boyfriend told me to keep walking and not hesitate. Thankfully, I knew what he meant. I hauled my ass into the entryway of the store. I watched the man walk up to my boyfriend and start talking with him while watching for any suspicious people or cars around them. When they were almost inside, I walked in too next to him and started chatting with the greeter so the man didn't get a chance to talk to me. The man showed up in all the aisles we were in and at one point pretended to be texting on his phone but was clearly taking photos of us. We didn't get to finish getting snacks. Instead, we left right away. I waited with the greeter as my boyfriend grabbed the car so I didn't have to walk through the dark lot. After that, I was in the gym every day at the same time due to my work schedule and usually had my girl roommate with me. Today though, I was alone for a quick and light lifting session. I wasn't even a minute in though when that exact same guy walked in. I had never seen him there before. Instantly, I felt like vomiting. I texted my boyfriend to let him know, but he was now away on military, so he was now panicking from a distance, unable to do anything. The man wasn't in gym attire, and he didn't have any equipment with him either. We were also at the gym furthest from that area from before, so I have no idea why he would have chosen to go to this particular one, unless he was a really big fan of this gym for whatever reason. The man came over and tried to talk to me. I politely said hello back, but tried to ignore him. He said a few more things, and a guy a few machines over, I think, could tell I was in a bit of trouble. He came over and pretended to be my friend, asking if I was ready to go. I said yes and tried to grab up my things. The creepy man then asked me where my husband was off to. I pretended not to hear him, as I kept on walking. When I came out after finishing my session, the man seemed to be gone. My new fake best friend was waiting on the bench outside the locker room. He said the man had waited around for a while but finally left. He had let the staff know what happened. They said the man wasn't even a member. He had told them he came there to pick up his girlfriend. My new friend walked me to my car, and I switched gyms after. Thankfully, we now live far, far away from the city, and I've never encountered that guy again. Neither has my boyfriend. Honestly, I believe they might have been trying to recruit him to make big money selling women or something, and that I was just a bonus woman to sell. Thank God for kind strangers who stood up to that guy and saved me. Those kinds of people will never realize how important they are in the world. I used to fight with my parents a lot as a teenager. That led to them kicking me out once I had graduated high school. I was almost 19 at that point. For me, that wasn't much of a problem. I had my own job, my own cheap car, and my friend's parents had a spare bedroom they were willing to let me rent out for a while. It worked out just fine for me. This being said, I will change all the names. Let's call my friend Kelly and her mom Lena. Her dad is Kenneth. Kenneth and Lena had a lot of weird friends due to the fact they were quite fierce partiers. A lot of these friends were genuinely nice people, just a little bit weird. You could tell they had issues such as drugs or criminal pasts. But none of them were bad or mean or creepy or anything like that. There was one particular guy though that was just beyond weird. Just someone who, even though I didn't know him at all, he made my skin crawl the moment I looked at him. We'll call him Joey. I came home from work one day, and the only person there at our house was Joey. As soon as I walked in, he said hello, then made some comment about how beautiful I was. I don't consider myself good looking in the slightest, so I just kinda said thanks and walked off to start doing my normal routine. As I was making my lunch and cleaning up my mess, I could feel someone staring at me from behind. It was Joey. He'd followed me into the kitchen and was now blocking the only doorway, just standing there watching me. I asked him if I could get him anything, but he shook his head and continued to watch me. This made me very uncomfortable, of course. I kinda shoved him out of the way and fled for my room. I locked the door until I heard everyone else get home. Joey finally left around dinner time. I thought it was fine and went about my nightly routine and went to bed as usual. He must have come back at some point though, because he was sitting at the breakfast table when I went down to get my cereal. Again, the whole time he just stared daggers at me, so I took my food to my room instead. Friday night rolled around. Lena, Kenneth, and Kelly told me they were going to throw this huge party, and I should invite whoever I wanted. I just had a gut feeling, though, that Joey was going to be there. I invited the most intimidating male person I could think of, my neighbor Charles. He was a pretty huge guy, around 6'5" or so. He was also covered nearly head to toe in tattoos and happened to be an ex-Hell's Angel. He was the type that, unless provoked, wouldn't hurt anybody. I explained while inviting him the day before about how Joey was behaving. What he told me scared the shit out of me. Turns out he actually knew Joey. Apparently, he was on the run from the police for raping some teenage girls the year before, and said I needed to stay as far away from him as possible no matter what. You'd think that would be where the scary part ended, but no, it gets worse. I'm usually not a cop caller myself since I can hang with an unsavory crowd sometimes, but I went straight home, packed all my things, left to a safe place, and called the police. Here's the worst part. When they finally arrested him, they took a look through his phone. I don't know how the hell he managed this, but he had multiple pictures of me on it. Most of them were of me sleeping, or me in the shower or using the bathroom. He had texts to another person about me, and about what they were planning to do with me when he got the opportunity. I no longer talk to Kelly or her parents, and when someone gives me a bad vibe, I instantly get away from them. I'll forever be grateful to Charles as well, because he might have just saved my life by letting me know all that. So I am super creeped out right now. I, 27 and female, was home alone last night, sleeping soundly in my bed in the middle of the night, like would be usual. I was suddenly woken up, though, by the sound of someone seemingly trying to push up on my locked bedroom window. I couldn't see the window from where I was. It was just past my footboard on the other side of the bedroom, and I was laying down. I could recognize that unmistakable sound, though. The window was locked. Someone was jiggling it around, trying to force it open. I know that sound because I've locked myself out on accident plenty of times before, and have tried to get in through that very same window. I sat up in alarm, only to get a good look. I saw a dark silhouette of a person looking in through the window. I laid back down for a moment, confused, tired, and groggy. I didn't believe I was actually seeing what I was seeing. When it finally clicked that I was, I shot right back up. Now though, as I looked back to the window, they were gone. I tried my best to get back to sleep, but of course I was too spooked to do so for the rest of the night. In the morning, I thought I might have just dreamed it. I called everyone I knew that it possibly could have been, and nobody knew anything about it. Nobody was at my house either. Nobody I knew would just try to get into my bedroom window in the middle of the night anyway, especially when I don't think this person even knocked on the front door before trying to jimmy open my window. I went outside to investigate, just to make sure I wasn't being completely crazy. I looked at the window. Lo and behold, handprints of whoever was trying to slide up the glass, all over it. It had rained that night too, so I could make out their muddy shoe prints going to and from my window, and all throughout my backyard as well. I have no idea who they were or what they wanted, but I'm really glad I remembered to lock my window that night. I'm a 27-year-old female. I graduated from high school about 10 years ago. In my freshman year, I was well known and had quite a bit of friends. I was very friendly with everyone, and every time I saw someone alone, I would greet them and offer them my friendship as well. Sometime during the year in my math class, though, we had a new guy. We'll call him Jose. Jose had recently moved to the US from Mexico. He hardly knew any English. Me being Hispanic, though, I was able to speak to him in Spanish at least and make him feel somewhat welcomed. Jose had no friends at all, and always sat by himself. In that math class, I started helping out Jose quite a lot actually. He would sit behind me and always play with my hair. Not my actual head, but just touching my hair so I could hardly feel it. I sort of felt like he had developed a crush on me. He was not bad looking either, so I didn't take it as a big deal. For a few months, he just continued to play with my hair like this. It became kind of a norm actually. He said he really loved it. Towards the end of those months, he said he wanted to play a game and asked me to write the things I loved the most in life. He said he would do the same, and we would both share papers once we were finished. Of course, I wrote down family, God, friends, a whole bunch of other normal things for a teenage girl. When I gave him back the list, he wanted specific names of everyone on it and said he would do the same. I did end up writing the names of my friends and family. One day, we were just hanging out in class when Jose leaned over and whispered to me, "Can I show you something? But you can't tell anyone, or else you're gonna have to pay for it." I was confused. I thought maybe he was going to ask me out or something. Jose suddenly pulled out a Ziploc bag. I couldn't really tell what was inside. It looked just like a big tangled mess. It wasn't until he placed it down on the table that I noticed it was a Ziploc bag completely full of my hair, over full even. Jose pulled up his sleeve and showed me his arm. He had 10 healed over knife scars just about that went down the length of his arm. There was a fresh wound as well. He grabbed my hairs from the bag, rubbed it on top of the freshly opened wound from the night before, and said, "You're mine now. I know what you love. I know who you love. If you don't do as I say, you'll pay for everything. These are all the scars and the souls that I owe. Anything and everything that happens from now on, think of me." My heart sank. He smirked. I ran out of class crying and ran to the office. Everyone was so confused. I asked to speak with my counselor immediately. I explained what happened, and Jose was pulled out of class. He was taken to the principal's office and expelled that very same day. Well, because of that, I now feared for my life. They found all of these notes he was collecting on other people in his backpack. Mine were in there. They had the most. They saw the scars and found my bag of hair. I never heard of Jose again. I've had some pretty fucked up shit happen in my life after that, and every time it did, I always thought of Jose. I haven't talked about this in years. I'm kind of afraid that if I even mention it, he'll hear it and will follow me once more. I got close with God now, closer than ever, and I pray every day that I'll never meet him again. Until this very day, I don't know if Jose was just messing with me or what, but I will tell you that after that encounter, I was no longer the super friendly and open-hearted person I used to be. I grew up in a small town, and when I say small, I mean small. As in, we didn't even have a store in that small town. What we did have, though, was a jail. Charleston Correctional, perched right on top of this great big hill. It basically held people who were really low risk. There were still some sketchy people there, though, who had been there for so long they'd earned good behavior treatment. My parents were getting divorced at the time. Both of them were smack dab in the middle of a midlife crisis, which left me to care for my 3 younger sisters all alone pretty much. My best friend lived just up the street from us. Remember, it was a small town, so up the street could still be a good 20 to 30 minute walk. There was a decent snowstorm one night. I got all my siblings tucked in for the evening before I decided to walk up and get my friend. She didn't like walking to my house alone, so I would always walk over and then walk back with her. As I walked to her house, I remember thinking just how quiet and eerie it was that night. When I arrived, her mom started yelling at me. Apparently, I didn't know this, a man had escaped from jail earlier that day. We decided it would be better for all of us to camp out at her house instead of walking back in the dark and snow. We were about to go get my sisters in her parents' car when her brother came crashing through the door in a panic. That guy was out on our street. Granted, he was like a mile and a half away, but I had been walking right towards him and not even known it. We grabbed my sisters and stayed at her house that night, listening to the snowmobiles on the trails out back looking for him. It turned out he had called a cab, murdered the driver with a hammer, ditched the cab in a field by Tate's farm, and eventually gotten caught. That field was only a mile away from my house. We talked about that for a long time afterwards, because none of us had ever worried about having a jail so nearby before that. It's a true story. Happened about 17 years ago in Charleston, Maine, if you want to check. That was the scariest and most unusual thing that ever happened in our small town. Back in late 2014, around October or November, I was 18 years old. I was very much enjoying my new freedom from the confines of childhood. At the time, I'd just gotten my driver's license and drove a 1998 Chevy sports van. I did pretty much everything in this van. It was pretty much a hangout spot on wheels, and I started making a lot of new friends. One night, when I went to go see some of these newfound friends, something happened that I still cannot explain. It was late at night when I decided to drive some odd 25 miles to go see my friends. Between my town and theirs were only dark, quiet country roads. Every once in a while, you'd pass a driveway maybe with a street light on the property, but that was about it. Ever since I was a kid, there had always been one road around the county that people liked to whisper about. They called it the Swamp Road. The road was located just past the local high school in the county closest to my town. This school was in the middle of nowhere, and it was a very eerie sight at night. The road itself was extremely dark and completely silent, located right in the middle of a large patch of woods. This made it even more terrifying. Of course, this was the path I had to take. As I pulled onto that road, I somehow managed to keep my cool. It was a commonly used shortcut to the area where I was going, so I had no issue driving down it at the time. The road had several hills along it as well, then came to an opening out of the woods, then banked right, then left again before hitting more hills and finally a stop sign. As I was hitting the very last hill right before the opening, at the edge of the woods, my eyes suddenly locked onto a bright white sheet on the side of the road. It was so distractingly bright in the darkness that I almost managed to hit a pothole. I ended up passing that white sheet by and continuing forward, but I started to think about things as I drove on. I've always been one to think about bags at the side of the road. What if it's money, or someone threw out a dog they didn't want, or something worse? My curiosity got the better of me, and once I hit that stop sign at the end, I decided to briefly turn back and see what that was. Right after the first turn, there was a small field entryway that I parked at. I decided to turn off the headlights and shut off the van as well. I'm not sure why I did that. I guess it was teen angst of not being afraid. The walk back to the edge of the woods was a bit longer. The only reason I didn't want to park closer was because a car could potentially come over the hill, get freaked out and wreck because of the van being parked there. I parked a little ways back and walked toward the edge of the woods. The moon was pretty bright out, so it wasn't that scary. Once I got a bit closer to the woods though, I noticed some of the trees were not quite dead yet, and covered up most of the light, making it nearly impossible to see. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight to see that the sheet was completely gone now. Nothing was there. My heart sank at first. Maybe it wasn't at this hill though. Maybe the next hill up or something. As I was about to start walking once more, I began to hear a rustling sound out in the woods. I didn't even have time to think. I didn't know if the sound was going away or coming right at me. All I remember is I heard something running fast in those woods, and it sounded like whatever it was dragging something along the ground. I ran back to my van, started it up, and immediately shot out of there. During the drive to my friend's home, I tried to tell myself that whatever I'd just witnessed was completely understandable and rational. Perhaps it had just been a sheet full of trash or something, and an animal had come and drug it away, got spooked when they heard me walking towards them in the woods and ran. I got to the park that I usually pick my friends up at and waited for them to arrive. I got out of the van for a moment to throw something away near the restrooms when I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the rear of my van and the side, there were bloody handprints all over it. No joke, I was looking at bloody dripping handprints on the back windows of my van. I was the only one there. I don't know if maybe someone was trying to prank me back at Swamp Road, but if they did, it really got me good. I was driving well over the speed limit the rest of the time because I was so scared. To this day, it's still the scariest thing that's ever happened to me. When I was about 14 or 15, we moved to a new town hundreds of miles from our old one near Los Angeles. The new town was older, much smaller community as well, very old-fashioned style, of people leaving the garage doors open at night because no one worried about security. My family, though, coming from a town where we knew better, never left any of our doors open. One weekend, my parents went out of town, leaving me home alone. They went back to our old city to visit my aunt and uncle. I didn't really care though. I just wanted to have the home to myself and be able to do whatever I wanted. I had a couple of friends over. We ordered some pizza and watched rented movies together. Around 10 or 11, everyone else went home. I was now home alone in this huge old 5-bedroom house. My bedroom and our family room were upstairs, so when my friends left, I just stayed upstairs with the TV on and started to fall asleep on the sofa. At around 1 a.m. though, I was suddenly woken up. I can't remember if I heard something or felt something, but I know that I woke up in a complete panic. I could hear noises coming from downstairs. I realized I was in the dark, with only the light from the TV to guide me. Our family room light had turned off for some reason, and I didn't remember ever turning it off. I jumped up and started turning lights on from upstairs. I could hear footsteps in the dark downstairs and hear someone walking across the tile flooring. My dad kept a shotgun for just in case upstairs in the spare bedroom. I knew how to use guns for my entire life, and he trusted me with it too. Back in the day, that wasn't so bad. I grabbed the shotgun. It was only a single shot loaded, so I put 3 more shells in my pocket. I walked very slowly downstairs. The stairway had very little light, as the light switch downstairs lit the bottom half only. I made my way over to the front room lamp, then to the kitchen light. I went down the hallway to the bottom floor bedroom, turning on every light I saw and checking every room. I didn't hear anything or see anything out of the ordinary now. I made special precaution to check my parents' bedroom and bathroom. I figured that if there was someone there, the burglar would surely be in there going for cash or jewelry. I didn't see any windows or doors open. I started to think that maybe I was just making myself hyped up over nothing. I made my way back to the stairway and the front room. The front room had a living room that my mom always called the sitting room. We were not allowed to hang out there usually, but it's where guests would sit down while waiting to enter the main home. You know, kind of a fancy room. Anyway, that room had the front door and the stairs leading to the side door to the garage. When I checked our front door, I saw it was locked. Then I turned to the garage door, only to see that door was unlocked. We kept that door leading from our house to the garage locked at all times. Something inside me dreaded to open it, but I figured I had to check the garage too now. When I opened the door from the house to the garage, I nearly crapped my pants. The garage door was open. This was impossible. My parents had left much earlier that day, and I knew for a fact that door had been closed after they left. I would have noticed if it was open at any point. While I was cleaning my room when my friends came over, I had taken all my laundry out to the garage. When I said goodbye to my friends, I walked out with them, and for sure I would have seen my garage door open at that point. I turned on all the lights in there as well. The garage was empty. just the big door rolled up. I hit the button to close it and locked the door from the garage to the house. I went back upstairs and pretty much stayed awake all night with the loaded gun next to me. Nothing happened during the night, thankfully. The next day, I put the shotgun back unloaded. I went outside to see if someone had maybe forced the door open or something. No tool marks or anything. I looked throughout the garage and noticed someone seemed to have opened my dad's toolbox. I couldn't tell if anything was missing though. It did in fact look like someone had been rooting around. I decided against telling my parents what happened when they came home. Only if my dad noticed something missing was I going to do so. Mostly because I knew how they were, and I didn't want them to blame me for leaving the door open when I'd clearly done nothing wrong. I also didn't want them to never leave me home alone again. I wonder if what shook me awake was the noise of the garage door opening, but I was too sleepy to realize it in the moment. To start, I suppose I should give you some context. This happened sometime in October. I was at my dad's apartment complex. I need to explain the building layout before I go on. It had 3 floors and 2 entrances, one in the front near the parking lot, and another right by some trees that divided the property and another house nearby. That back entrance was where I usually smoked at night. I didn't want my dad giving me shit for smoking weed in the apartment. I was smoking out of a shitty homemade bong made out of a 1-liter Pepsi bottle. I had just finished a bowl actually, and was packing another one. I had just taken my next hit, and blew out a huge cloud of smoke. All of a sudden, I could see in my peripherals that something was moving around in those trees. I thought it might be a deer at first. I was a little bit sketched out though, because the area of Canada I live in is known for having some real bad drug addicts and other crazy-ass people. I pushed the feeling aside initially and simply took another hit. This time I knew for sure I saw something though. I could see someone sneaking on the little path in the woods. I immediately took one final hit when I saw a man wearing what looked like blue coveralls, wearing a clown mask. Normally, I get the fuck back inside and go back to my apartment. I was so high in that moment though, I called out to the man, "Hey man, you want a hit?" The man looked over to me. I couldn't see his eyes because of the mask, but I could tell he was glaring daggers at me. The man went to reach behind his back as I fumbled for my keys. I stuck them into the lock and shakily unlocked the door as the man began to charge at me. He was holding what looked to be a gut-hook knife. I got in before he arrived and threw the door shut. The man managed to sneak his arm inside though and hold the door open. At that moment, I knew I was fucked. I yelled out for help as loud as I could. I didn't know what to do for a moment. Then I remembered some martial arts from my 10th grade classes. I threw a kick at his arm as hard as I could, and I ended up breaking it. The man dropped the knife, of course, and yelled out, "Oh, you motherfucker!" He ran full force at the door. I gave him the middle finger and slammed it in his face. I ran back to my apartment and called the cops right away. A few Mounties rushed in, and I gave them my statement. We were told they were looking for a man fitting his description. He had slashed 2 random people with the same knife he dropped, and one of them was in critical condition. They caught the man in the end when he tried to go to the hospital for his broken arm. His fingerprints were on the knife, and he was sentenced to 8 years in prison. I still do smoke weed out there, but now I always carry a knife with me, and I always keep my guard up. So this is a story about what my mother experienced in our house when she was little. We live in the same old farmhouse she grew up in. When my mom was about 13 to 16 years old, my grandpa used to have to leave for a few days on business trips, as he was a big dealer in grain bins. My grandpa and grandma had divorced and no longer lived together. My mom would be left alone at the house because of this, and the neighbors would keep watch over her. Now, this wasn't such a big deal, because where my mom is from and where my family lives, It was a very small town in South Dakota. Pretty much everyone trusted each other. On multiple separate occasions, my grandpa would leave for a day or two, and my mom would be left all alone. Most of the time, she would invite her friends over to keep her company and enjoy the freedom of having no guardians around. After a while, though, friends were simply invited over so she wouldn't have to be alone, and here's why. Late at night, my mom and her friends would be chatting in her room or sleeping, when all of a sudden, they'd hear the cellar doors of the basement open from the outside and someone walking down the stairs. The cellar was only accessible by those doors outside and from a single door in the kitchen. Once they heard that sound, they all froze in fear. My mom said usually after that would happen, someone would take a stick and walk around raking all of the pipes and vents to make an echoing sound throughout the house and let my mom and her friends know the person was there. They lived in the upstairs portion, which is where all the rooms are located. Directly in the middle of the upstairs was a hallway leading down to the dining room/living room, and at the bottom of those stairs was the patio door. Back when my mom was little, there used to be a really creaky screen door and main door that led to that room. Next to that door on both sides were two large windows that showed out onto the front lawn and patio. My mom said that person would then walk to the screen door and repeatedly open and close it, slowly, over and over. They would walk around the home, scraping all the windows with a stick, sometimes even walking around the whole house multiple times. If they weren't scraping those windows, they were pacing back and forth on the patio. It was a pitch-dark house and property, a mile out of town. Just to put into perspective how terrifying this was for her, this person was clearly trying to mess with her. This was in the early 80s, so there was only one phone in the home, downstairs, in the living room, which just so happened to be directly above the cellar and basement. My mom and her friends had to run downstairs in the night while someone was wandering around the house and just outside. They'd call a family friend named Kevin. Every time they did, when Kevin arrived, the man would be gone. This went on for about 4 months or so, and only ever happened when my grandpa was away from the home. My mom believes it was the neighbor from down the road. We lived just outside of town, so our neighbor's neighbor was about 1/4 of a mile away. My mom said that he and his wife were batshit crazy. They didn't like anyone petting their horses, which my mom didn't know when she'd done so before. She was chased by the wife with a shotgun after. Goes to show just how crazy they were. My mom thinks he walked all the way up just to torment her for coming around their horses that one time, and of course just because they were crazy as well. We all have no way of knowing, but it's still insane nonetheless. The story used to really terrify me as a kid, especially since we still live in that same house. I was 15, living in the Mojave Desert in Southern California during the 90s. Lots of wide open space and not many people around. One weekend, my dad and I take out our dirt bikes via trailer to the outskirts of a very small town called Barstow. It was midsummer, so not a lot of people were out riding, which typically was a common sight. The heat must have had something to do with it. After unloading our bikes, we decided to trek for a few hours, keeping track of landmarks and marking trails with red cloth under rocks to find our way back easily. After some time of riding and refueling brakes, we crested a hill, only to see a dilapidated cabin. There were many lone buildings in the Mojave, but rarely anything like this. This felt out of place right off the bat. Being the intelligent people we were, we decided to check this abandoned abode out. We opened the front door. The doorknob was barely hanging on. It seemed to be a single room, no bigger than a studio apartment. It was very obvious, though, that people had been staying there. There were candy wrappers, beer cans, lots of things with recent dates as well. A lone bucket outside reeked of heat-cooked human droppings. There was no furniture, but there was a single wall-mounted bench and a fireplace. The ceiling had lots of people carving names, messages, typical hearts with a date and 2 people's names. I decided to take a rest on the bench for a moment. As I sat down, I tucked my feet under the bench and put my toes on their tips on the floor. The instant I did this, I felt the floor begin to give way. In surprise, I looked down at the floor, which didn't seem to be attached to the rest of the wooden floor. I removed this cutout piece, about a 2-foot square. I called for my dad. He looked down through the hole with the flashlight from his bike. It went down about 7 feet and back far enough for neither of us to be able to see the end. This is when my dad showed his parental instinct. He looked over to me. "Well, I'm too fat to check this out. You gonna go see what's down there?" I took this as a challenge and climbed down by myself. There was a hallway carved out of the desert bedrock that went back about 15 feet. I walked along cautiously until it opened up into a large circular room. The room was empty, but it was very big. I continued to walk around until I stubbed my toe on something. I looked down, only to see a metal rod embedded into the bedrock with thick chains welded on. I looked over to the walls. The walls were full of scratch marks from fingernails, tons of them. The more I looked, the more I could see that there were bits of fingernail embedded in those scratches in the rock. My eyes began to water, and my heart started to race. I was legit freaking out now. I spider-monkeyed right out of the entrance and told my dad everything while trying to hold back my tears. He looked very worried. We hopped on our bikes and tailed it into high gear. Following those red rags we left as landmarks was the most stressful time I can remember in my life. We got back to the truck, loaded up, and booked it home. My dad hid the truck in the garage for a few days after, just to be sure no one recognized it and followed us. Never went back, and don't intend to either. We reported this to the police, but we never heard anything about it after. It was a Sunday early in the morning. I live in the suburbs, but my parents own a farm that I enjoy going to because I get to see my dog when I'm there. Her name is Molly, and she's a mutt. She's not a tiny dog by any means, though. At the time, I felt very safe around her and would often take her for walks in a forest that was nearby. The day started off like any other. Me and my dad got in the car, drove around for a while, and arrived at the farm. I immediately got out and hugged Molly. My parents always got angry when I hugged her, since I'd smell like dog for the rest of the day. I put her leash on and asked my dad if I could take her for a walk real quick. He always thought we would just go down a road and back, but I always found it more interesting to take her out into the forest. I felt a certain kind of peace and relaxation there that was unmatched by anything else. We took a turn and headed out. As usual, when I got there, I'd take her leash off, so she could go explore the woods on her own. Most of the time, I'd carve my name into the trees or look for anything interesting nearby. I was playing baseball with some rocks and a wooden leg, presumably from an old table, when I heard it. Molly was barking at something. This wasn't unusual when we were out in the forest. I thought it was a fox, or perhaps some other animal. I quickly grabbed the wooden leg and held it like a weapon. I knew if it was a fox, I wouldn't have to attack it, but I felt a sense of security while I was holding it still. I called out, "Molly! Molly!" but she just kept on barking. This was very strange for me, since she always came right to me whenever I called her. I followed the sound of her barks and stumbled across a scene I'll never forget. There was a man, in his late 50s or so, half naked and carrying a large machete in one hand. He was holding some moonshine in the other. This was the first time I'd ever stumbled across someone this far out into the woods, let alone someone half naked and carrying a big-ass machete. He was completely ignoring Molly, hacking away at the ground for some reason. I didn't really know how to handle the situation. Even now, I would have no idea how to handle this. Sir, are you okay?" I asked in confusion. I don't think I understood the seriousness of this situation at the time. The man turned around, revealing his face. He had some of the clearest blue eyes I've ever seen to this day. I could see them so well because they were open so wide. "Come here, boy." Look what I dug up. I was afraid that if I didn't listen to him, he would start chasing after me. That was something I wanted to avoid at all costs. I got a bit closer, but kept a good distance between us. I didn't see anything except for an empty hole. He returned to hitting the ground with his machete, occasionally taking sips from the bottle. I used this window of time to grab my dog and start walking away slowly, as to not notify him I was leaving. I took one final glance at the man. His head was dug deep in the hole. I was intrigued, so I kept on looking. I know, stupid of me. He finally retrieved his head from the ground. I was shocked when I saw him carrying a bone in his mouth. I have no idea what animal it belonged to, or even if it did belong to one. I had seen enough now. I started sprinting with my dog. As we ran, I heard him laughing, and then I saw something flying at me from the corner of my eye. It was that damn machete. It barely missed me. I heard him call out in frustration. "God damn it!" This made me run even faster. I knew the forest very well, so I wasn't afraid of getting lost. I ripped through branches and bushes until I arrived out of that forest. I didn't stop sprinting until I got to the garage, where my father was testing out lights on our tractor. I didn't tell him a single thing about the man, since I was afraid he'd get angry and wouldn't allow me to walk Molly anymore. Needless to say, though, I never went out to that forest alone again anyway. Last year, I moved to another city after finishing high school. I assessed several college options and decided on one that would have me move roughly 3 hours away. I found an apartment where I was able to live without roommates, and that was in a safe part of town with a reasonable rent as well. It was close to some attractions in the city too, which was an added bonus to me, as it would allow me to have a reasonable social life. For the first 4 months or so, it was actually really great. There were absolutely no problems or safety concerns of any sort. I managed to become good friends with a guy who studied at the same college as me. It just so happened that he lived around 5 minutes away from me, so we would often hang out at each other's places. One night, just as winter started, he called me over to play video games and hang out. We had a pretty chill night, drank a few beers, and had a good few laughs. We enjoyed ourselves quite a bit. At around 1 a.m., we decided to call it a wrap for the night, and I headed home to my apartment. When I got back home, I decided to head out on the balcony for a moment that overlooked the entrance of my building. I wanted to have a cigarette and take in the scenery. I vividly remember looking all around and not seeing anybody out and about. It was a cold winter night and it wasn't the weekend, so understandably everybody was probably at home. Beside the usual car or two passing by, it was dead silent. Once I finished my cigarette, I decided to call it a night myself and got ready for bed. I was understandably confused when I suddenly heard a short ring on my doorbell. I stood in the center of my room for a good few seconds in confusion. A little bit of fear set in. I snapped out of it though and decided to tiptoe over to my door and try and see if anyone was outside. My immediate thought was that my friend must have come over to drop something off. Maybe I'd forgotten something. But then, after a bit more thinking, I thought to myself, surely he would have texted me or called me then. I listened out for about half a minute or so, when the person once again rang the doorbell and softly knocked a few times. I was completely still and didn't want to make a sound so I wouldn't give away the fact I was at the door. I heard the stranger pacing around outside for a few seconds before he stopped in front of the door again. I waited to hear any sort of noise, but it was quiet. That was when I decided to look through the peephole to see that hopefully he would have left. I picked up the lid cover of the peephole and took a look out. My legs pretty much went numb as I saw a hooded figure standing outside, looking straight into the peephole. He was holding the zipper of his hoodie so as to cover his entire face. All I could really make out was his forehead. He must have either heard me lift the cover or heard my heavy breathing, because right away he moved from the peephole and called out to me, "I know you're there at the door." By this point, I was pretty much shivering in fear, but I mustered up the courage to say I was calling the cops. He just laughed at me. "Ha, sure thing, big guy." He proceeded to wipe away the door handle with his sleeve before walking off. I understandably called the police, and when they came over, they informed me that I wasn't the only one this had happened to. He'd been doing this for at least a month, and they suspected him of at least one home invasion, where thankfully the father had chased him out of the house. I crashed at my friend's house for around a week or so after this, before going back to my own place. It's been a year since then, and I've never heard any further news about him. He could have been arrested by now, but as far as I know, he hasn't. I find it more likely he simply moved on to a different area. I'm not sure if he had any violent intention or not, but either way, I hope I don't ever encounter him again. This happened about 10 years ago, when I was on summer break. I was 15 years old. I grew up in a very run-of-the-mill, middle-class neighborhood in San Antonio. Our house sat on a corner, and the fence around the backyard had horizontal wooden beams that almost made an X, as opposed to a vertical fence post that I'm more familiar with. Because of this, there were larger gaps in between the beams, and peeking through was fairly easy. Another detail worth noting, our back gate on the side of the house near the road had been wide open many mornings. Because of this, my dad had looped some wire through the latch and twisted it like a bread tie to keep it engaged. We'd close it every time, but somehow it still kept ending up open. In the backyard, there was a large deck and an above-ground pool that the deck was built up to on one end. A huge, beautiful oak tree shaded the deck and part of the pool closest to the house, so my sister and I would anchor our feet at the farthest edge and sunbathe on our floats. This happened on a Sunday. My grandfather was visiting, and he and my parents were inside napping. My older sister was gone with her friends to a different pool, and I decided to go float about in the backyard. My mom closed the blinds to the back and habitually locked the back door before laying down on the couch to snooze. As I was in the pool for about 20 minutes, I noticed that someone was standing on the other side of the fence, peeking in. The sun was shining in my face, so I couldn't see him that well. I did find it quite weird, but I didn't say anything. I saw the person walk off, and I didn't think that much about it. Minutes passed by, and I decided to actually swim around a bit and cool off, then get back on the float. This time on my stomach, though, with my face looking up at the house instead of towards the fence. It felt like just a minute had passed by when I heard the sudden sound of wood creaking. I turned around, only to see a man now halfway over my back fence, about 15 feet away from me. Once he hit the ground, part of me was in shock. I froze for a moment before sheer terror and panic took over. This is not a dream. This was really happening, and I needed to get back inside right now. I felt as though that small pool had become Olympic-sized. I couldn't get to the edge and climb out fast enough. By the time I made it out of the pool and started running to the back door, the man had already made his way around it and was up on the deck coming towards me. He appeared to be in his late 20s or early 30s, pretty thin and around my height, 5'9". He was just walking with purpose the entire time and never spoke a single word. I got to the back door only to find it locked. I started screaming for them to let me in and pounding on the door. At least my mom was right there to unlock it, but those 30 seconds felt like 10 minutes. When my mom finally opened the door, the man was just standing right behind me with this blank look in his eyes. I was crying, my grandpa was freaking out, and the man was just standing there looking inside at me. My dad ran downstairs and went crazy, screaming at the man and pushing him, telling him to get the hell out of here. My mom was on the phone with the police at this point, and the next moment makes the whole thing 10 times creepier. The man turned around, walked around the house over to our back gate, which had the wire in the latch, mind you, and untwisted it. He pushed through, leaving the gate wide open, as it normally was. He walked back across the street and went into our neighbor's house. The police arrived soon after. It turned out the man had been staying with his sister for the past 8 weeks and was on parole/recently released from jail. Theft and assault charges, I believe. He had broken into a different neighbor's home and stolen some china and a few of their family photos. He went back to jail soon after, and we never found the back gate left open again. I still get chills thinking about this, because my sister and I both had our bedrooms downstairs, with our windows facing the backyard. I just know he was coming in there and watching us at night. My parents moved out of this home a few years later when I went to college, but I slept upstairs on a pull-out couch for months after this, and I'll never live on the ground floor again, if I can help it. My name is Ben, and I live in Australia. In the southeast of Australia lies the state of Victoria, and in that state lies the High Country, an extremely vast and remote expanse of alpine mountains and valleys that's largely only accessible by 4-wheel drive and takes days to get in and out of. And the place is popular with 4-wheel drivers, deer hunters, and hikers as well. We 4WD, and this was the destination chosen to go camping for a few days with my partner Jess and I. Some time away from the world beyond the reach of mobile phones. The 4WD was loaded up, lists double-checked, vehicle maintenance done, fuel loaded onto the roof racks, the police station closest to our destination notified of our trip, and off we went. We were headed to a place called the Wanangata Valley, a remote valley deep in the high country. A huge amphitheater-type valley, with alpine mountains rising high in every direction, and a river running along the valley floor. Towards the end of the first full day of driving, we finally made our way down the last track for the day, skirting the ridge and arriving at the valley floor, just as the sun dipped below the mountains. We found a secluded spot to pitch our tent, nested in amongst the trees by the riverbank. It was a midweek and off-season, so we were the only ones there that we knew of. After setting up camp and having a meal by the fire as the sun went down, we snuggled up together in our sleeping bags and in short order decided to hit the hay. At some point in the night, though, I awoke to a loud noise outside. I wasn't sure what I was hearing, so from the inside of our tent I listened. I didn't hear anything else. I thought I must have been going mad. No sooner than I'd thought that, though, I heard another noise. It sounded like something falling off our camp table and hitting the ground. I put it down to possums or wombats messing about, common in the area, and nothing to worry about. I should have packed up after dinner, I thought, and simply went back to sleep. Sunrise came and we slowly woke up. Needing to pee, I opened the tent and jumped out. Looking around, though, something came over me. A chill. It was not the way we'd left it. Instead of seeing 2 chairs together by the fire where we'd been sitting, one of them was by the table, and on the table was a loaf of bread I swore I'd packed away the night before. I walked over to the table to inspect. A half-eaten piece of bread was sitting right there, with a very obvious chomp mark taken out of it. I flung the tent open. "Were you up before me? Did you have some bread?" "No," was the answer. Jess and I got up together and went through all of our stuff. Nothing seemed to be missing. As we went to check the vehicle, I noticed footprints. There were a bunch of them around the front of the car where the hood was. Most of the camp was covered with grass. This was one of the only few spots that was just dirt. Had someone tried to open it? There were very distinct footprints, not mine or my partner's. Maybe they'd already been there before we got there. These camping spots are used intermittently, and obviously we weren't looking at the ground when we arrived the night before, with the sun setting and all. I don't think either of us wanted to actually admit what we were both thinking, that someone had been creeping about our campsite in the night, far from civilization. We discussed if a possum could have made the bite marks, and argued about if one of us had left the bread out on accident. We eventually discussed moving on and camping somewhere else instead. After much deliberation, though, we decided to stay. I had the rifle in the vehicle, and I guess that gave me an overinflated sense of safety. In hindsight, it was a very poor choice. As the day rolled on and the sun shining and nothing eventful happening, I decided to walk across the valley floor, about 800 meters to an old ruin of an isolated homestead, probably built by settlers who ran cattle in the valley some hundreds of years ago. Steeped in mystery, really. There's an old unsolved murder from 1917 that always captivates people too. I read the plaque, took some photos, and started wandering back to camp. As I neared the halfway mark back, I noticed Jess was walking across the field towards me. Must have gotten bored, I thought. As she approached, though, it was clear she was in a panic. Immediately, she started telling me how she went down to the riverbank to wash the pots and pans, when, as she looked up, she saw someone over on the other side of the river, watching her from deep in the bush. I had no reason whatsoever not to believe her. I asked about what he looked like, and got told an old man, 70 or thereabouts, scraggly looking and in old tattered clothes. Apparently, the second he'd noticed she'd noticed him. He got up and walked away, disappearing into the impenetrable brush. I couldn't comprehend it. How was anyone out here without a four-wheel drive or a dirt bike? And how would anyone get to that side of the bank without first crossing over from our side? There's days worth of damn near impossible to walk through foliage on the other side just to get to where my partner saw him. We decided to jump in the vehicle and drive along the length of the alley, checking the dozen or so riverside camping spots as we went. I wanted to spot a camp, have my partner ID the guy, and make sure he wasn't creeping. Our theory being that he may have been a hunter. After making our way up and down the valley and not seeing anything though, we drove back to camp at a loss to explain anything. As the sun started to set, and with my partner and I quite shaken now, I grabbed the rifle and sat it next to us as we cooked dinner and chatted, having drinks to settle the nerves. We talked a bit and settled into a good foot warming in front of the fire. At some point, Jess needed to go to the toilet. I was asked to come with her to the spot behind a tree where we'd place the portable toilet. Considering everything that had gone on, it was a no-brainer. Jess did her business and we turned around and came around the side of the tree. That's when we saw him, standing in our camp about a meter from the rifle I had sitting against the table, was an old man. Jess squeezed my arm so hard I thought it was going to come off. Everything about her body language screamed, "This is him." As we got closer, I could make out some more odd things about him. He had part of a deer antler in his hand that looked like he'd been whittling away at it, and what looked like antler pieces carved to plug large holes in his ears. Same goes for the bone-looking buttons on his ratty old coat. He wore leather shoes that looked homemade. "Good day," he said. "Fuck me, mate, you gave us a fucking heart attack," I said. "Where have you come from? Everything all right?" "Just over yonder. You lot aren't hunting anything around here, are you?" He looked directly at the rifle. "We might be. Why?" "Oh, there's no hunting around here. Not enough deer as it is." "Well, we hadn't decided on it. Probably packing up soon anyway." I edged my way towards the rifle. "I should put this away. I didn't mean to spook you," I said, looking for an excuse to grab it up in my hands. "It's all good. Things like that don't spook me." I picked up the rifle by the barrel and held it like a walking stick in an attempt to be non-confrontational. "No offense, but you really caught us by surprise there. You gotta be the only person we've seen since we got here." "Yeah, I saw you come in last night. I've been coming up here for 40 years. Beautiful spot, isn't it? Takes a bit to get down into the valley, eh?" "Yeah, man, look, no offense, but we're gonna hit the sack soon. Do you need a lift back or something?" "No, all good. Just out for a wander before I tuck in for the night. I saw the fire and thought I'd say hello. Anyway, I'd better be on my way." With that, he turned around and walked off into the dark, no torch in hand. That was officially enough to spook us beyond any ability to calm down. We decided to pack up in the dark and head out, even if driving in the dark was monumentally stupid in this part of the high country. We got in and drove out, taking us along the valley floor. We didn't see a single fire, camp, vehicle, nothing. We kept on driving. Halfway home, Jess, bored from the drive, flipped on the camera. The memory card was missing. After getting home and telling a few people what happened, my friend's dad, an avid bushman himself, was the one to officially freak us the hell out. "Oh, you met the Button Man." "The what now?" I said. "The Button Man. He's an old bushman who goes out into the high country for months at a time, hunts with a spear, appears out of nowhere. He loves scaring people, has these buttons made out of bone. There's a lot of people that go missing up that way. The cops keep looking, but they can't find a single trace. Campers, hikers, one camp was found burnt to the ground and the car left abandoned. Can't find any evidence at all." A quick Google search after confirmed it to my surprise. The missing people, the Button Man, the lack of evidence. Police set out into the bush and found his camp, spoke with the man too, but found nothing else to go on. During my research, I found out that not only is he very real, dozens have met him. He always appears out of nowhere at their camp, but as for his connection to any of the missing people, only he can know. We don't camp that valley anymore. Hell, we don't camp that side of the high country anymore. Anyway, that's our story of how we met the Button Man. Let me first say that this story is a little bit depressing, and it makes me feel sad writing it down. But that doesn't change the fact that this was one of the most frightening nights of my entire life. My father passed away when I was 4 or 5 years old, and my mom met David when I was 10. He ended up adopting me several years later. Even though he wasn't my real father, he raised me as though I was his own daughter, and I loved him like he was my real dad. You know what? Scratch that. I hate that phrase, real dad. Because he wasn't like a real father. He was my father. He was a great man and treated my mother and I like we were the most important things in the world. Unfortunately, a few months back, David passed away. He got sick very suddenly and died not long after. It was a sad event, and it hit my mom especially hard. He was old, but it didn't hurt any less. My elderly mother was already declining in her health, and we were worried this may be the final straw that broke her back. A few nights after the funeral, my mom began to call me in the middle of the night. Every time I thought, oh no, and figured the worst. It was bad, but not that type of bad. She was absolutely terrified. 2 nights in a row, she called me and claimed that somebody was in her house, and she could hear them moving around. She was incredibly scared. My husband and I felt horrible on both days we went over and searched the entire house, only to find nothing out of place. It didn't look like anybody broke in, nothing was stolen, and we triple-checked that everything was locked up tight. On the third day, my mom finally begged me to stay overnight. This was so if the intruder showed up again, I could witness and either stop them or call the police or something. Honestly, I just thought my mom was really tired and dreaming, and thinking her dreams are real or something. At some point during the night, I thought that I heard someone or something coming from the dining room. It was pretty jarring, because it was clearly a voice. For a single second, I thought my mom might be right, and there really were people breaking into the home. I slowly got off the couch and started to head towards this noise. I ruled out ghosts immediately, because I'm not really into any of that. I started to think that maybe it was someone homeless or something, and they were squatting inside an elderly person's home. All these ideas were running through my head a million miles an hour as I was drawing closer to the noise. When I was only one room away, I could hear the voice more clearly. It was my mom. I stopped sneaking at that point and walked into the dining room. My mom was sitting at the head of the table, having a full-blown conversation with nobody. It was the strangest thing I'd ever seen. Her eyes were wide open, but they were almost glazed over. She was awake and asleep at the same time. She never looked in my direction, but she seemed to know that I walked in. In a cheerful voice, she said, "Hello, dear. I'm just enjoying some time with David." I looked over, and the chair next to her was slightly pulled out, like my mom had pulled it out for someone to sit in. I got closer to her, and when I saw her eyes, they were even more disturbing. It was like I could only see the white parts of them. Mix that with her eerie smile and talking in the moment, and it was incredibly creepy. I gently tried to remind my mother that David had passed away. She just laughed and waved her hand in my face. "You're so silly. David's sitting right there." I was at a loss for words. I didn't know the correct way to handle this. Do I just make my grieving and elderly mother happy and let her think she's talking to her dead husband? Or do I try to wrangle her way back to reality and crush her with heartbreak? She grabbed my hand, still not looking in my direction or changing her facial features in any way. "You can leave now, sweetie. I don't know why I was so scared. It was just David cleaning the house that I heard last night. It was just David." I remember word for word. She just kept repeating that last part. Her sleep-talking devolved into gibberish. Then, every once in a while, I would hear the name David slip out of her mouth. I didn't realize until that night just how hard my mother took the loss and how fragile her mind had become. When I tried to move, my mother snapped and growled at me like she was a wild animal. "Don't touch me! I'm talking to him!" I called my husband, and he met me over there. We decided to call 911 because we didn't know what else to do. They tried to take her to the hospital, but she became extremely hostile and violent. Not because we were taking her from her home, mind you, but because we were taking her from David. She kept saying she wasn't allowed to leave because David wanted her there. The mind can truly conjure up anything when it's hurting. My mother passed away not long after that night, God rest her soul. She never came back to herself after that night. Her half-opened eyes and sleepwalking appearance never went away. The doctors told me she had some type of nervous breakdown, and due to her age, she could no longer separate reality from her mind. It really is so sad. When my biological father passed away, my mom was a wreck, but buried those emotions to raise me. David saved her in so many ways, so when she lost him, it was like she lost everything in that moment. I'm sorry if the story was a bit of a downer, but I'll never forget how my mother was acting that night. I'm a skeptical person myself, but a part of me almost believes that David really was there with her. It's creepy. The mind is an insane tool. Even just my mom thinking the man was sitting with her freaks me out a little bit. Take care of yourself, folks, and tell your loved ones you love them any chance you get. I think the word toxic is actually toxic. We throw the word around like it's some sort of frisbee. One topic that's always got brought up in that toxic conversation is toxic exes. How exes are terrible. Not all exes are bad, mind you, but the ones that are, I truly think encompass the word toxic. You see, I was engaged a few years ago, and it ended very poorly. My fiancée got a job about 100 miles from our hometown, so I moved with her and started a life there. I didn't have friends or family or anyone to turn to when we broke up, and because of the job I'd started, I decided not to head home just yet. It's not important how things ended, but they did end very poorly. She begged me to come back at the end, but I couldn't put myself through all of that all over again. Not right after the breakup. She kept the house, and I found a small one-bedroom apartment. I just hoped I would be able to meet some new friends, which I'm really bad at, by the way. A few weeks after we'd broken up, I was sitting in the apartment sulking, which was my favorite hobby around that time. The apartment was on the first floor of the building, which was really like the half-basement, if that makes any sense. My windows were at level 1. It was just my head that was above ground. The rest of the apartment was below it. I had a lovely view of absolutely nothing to help me cope with my crippling depression at the time. One night, while I was just sort of being a bum, my power went out. We were having a pretty bad storm. The last time we'd had a storm like this, the power had gone out for several hours. I knew I couldn't just sit there in silence, and since it was getting late, I couldn't really go anywhere anyway, even though I probably wouldn't have if I could. I lit up a few candles that I had and sat at my table. It was a small table that only fit 2 chairs. I loved to draw and color in high school, and I had some talent before I gave it up. This was the perfect opportunity for me to draw and just sort of get lost in something that I used to love. While I was drawing, trying to get my mind off the events going on in my life, I heard something. It was a loud noise that sounded close by. Unfortunately, it was too dark to see everywhere in my apartment, other than the little area I was sitting in with the candles. I slowly walked over to where I heard the noise. Lying at my window outside was what looked to be some sort of figure. I jumped back because I was scared. I knew this was a crazy idea. No one would break into this apartment. They would have to get on their stomach and practically crawl inside. Not to mention, hardly anyone in town even knows who I am. I went back to the small table and blew the candles out. I wanted to use the darkness to my advantage and be able to see out the window better. I didn't know for sure what I was seeing at this point, and it's possible it could have just been a skunk or something trying to escape the storm. I just didn't know. I went back over to the window, and I could see it clearly now. This was no animal, and it was not my imagination either. Lying against the ground, trying to open the window, was a person dressed in all black clothes. I freaked out. I didn't know what to do. The obvious answer was to call the police or the authorities or whoever, but I don't know why. In the heat of the moment, that just didn't cross my mind. The only person I really knew was my ex-fiancée. I decided to give in to my fear and loneliness and call her for help. Right as I pressed call, though, a light could be seen shining out through the window, and a brief melody of a ringtone could be heard. The call went right to voicemail after that. Knowing what was most likely happening, I decided to call right back and see if it was just a coincidence. Sure enough, the light and ringtone went off for a split second before the intruder outside shut it off. It was my ex, trying to break into my apartment. Why at this hour in this weather? Her intentions were clearly sinister. I started to yell, but she kept trying to break in through the window. Thankfully, it remained locked, and I called the police. As soon as she heard me on the phone, I saw her get up and run off. I told the cops everything when they arrived. They actually didn't believe me right away. They looked almost annoyed, like I was bothering them with this, but when they looked out the window, they could see the spot in the dirt where someone had been laying down, and there were clearly signs of forced entry. They finally agreed to follow up and see where my ex was. When the cops went and questioned her, of course she seemed to deny everything, which didn't really surprise me. She said that she had been with her new boyfriend and that I needed to move on. The guy also vouched for her. He said that she was at the house the entire night with him. Either this guy was in on it, or she was already manipulating him. I caught her out for being a liar, and I was the one who was branded a liar and crazy ex at the end of it. When I brought up that I'd called her twice and both times the phone lit up, she said her phone was broken so it couldn't have been her. That was it for me. I couldn't live in this town anymore. Now that I didn't feel safe being here, I paid an early termination fee for my lease and moved away to stay with my family until I got back on my feet. I've never heard from her again, and I'm so thankful for that. My life is much better without that toxic human being ruining it. It was winter break freshman year of college. I drove up to visit one of my friends in northwestern Pennsylvania for New Year's. I needed to be back home the next day for work, so I decided to drive back at around 2 a.m. in the morning. I was driving down Interstate 79. For anyone reading this from Pennsylvania, it was Grove City where this event took place. I saw maybe 2 cars in that entire 60-mile span. I came up around a bend and saw what looked like a black bear in my lane. I swerved and went off the road. I crashed into the tree line next to the highway. I was in the middle of nowhere now, and the bear just booked it off into the woods. My car was completely totaled, and I knew I wasn't going to be seeing anyone around for hours to help me out. I called 911, and they said they would be there in around 30 minutes. I got out of the car and stood on the shoulder of the highway to wait. After about 5 minutes, though, I heard some rustling in the bushes, and there it was. The bear emerged. It turns out that when I slipped off the road, I hit a cub, and the mama bear was now pissed as all hell. I booked it over to the back of the car and jumped inside the trunk. Thank God I had a big Ford Expedition, so the bear was not able to open it. For another half an hour, though, the bear ran the car trying to get at me in a wild frenzy. The police showed up, and the sirens scared the bear off into the woods again. That was the most terrifying experience of my entire life. This happened my senior year of college, Christmas break 2006. I worked for a professor that asked me to house/dog sit for him while he was out of town to see the bowl game we were in. He was gone for about 3 days and had a huge piece of land in the middle of nowhere. I invited my girlfriend at the time to come with me. He had horses, fishing, a gator, etc. So the first 2 nights went down with no incident, but on the last night, his little foofy dog started having a fit. She kept barking at the back door all of a sudden. At first, we just blew it off, but decided to lock the dog inside in case there was a coyote out there or something. After a while, we started to get a little creeped out though. I kept saying it was probably just an animal and we'd be perfectly fine. My girlfriend wanted to go investigate and see what was out there. I thought it was a bad idea, but what can I say? She went outside and said she'd seen a glimpse of something small and gray, but it ran off. Alright, so just an animal. No worries. By this time, we were both really spooked though. At this moment, the dog started barking at the window on the other side of the house. We were still trying to ignore it, but we were starting to get a little bit worried. We decided to get into bed together. There was an awkward, fearful silence. and then I began to hear it. There was what sounded like a young woman singing a soft, eerie lullaby outside. I didn't say anything, hoping my mind was just playing tricks on me. And that's when my girlfriend turned over to me. "Let's get the fuck out of here." "Why?" I asked. "You didn't hear that girl singing?" "Okay, yeah, let's get out of here." Sure enough, we left right away. I even called someone to talk to me while we walked out to my car. The next morning, we went back to clean up the house and such, but we didn't find any signs of anyone having been outside. The most scared I've ever been, really. Years ago, around Halloween, my family had gathered to watch some scary movies. My mom loved these sorts of things. My dad didn't care very much for them, though, so he would get up every few minutes to work on something or other. We had started watching Hitchcock's The Birds, and it was getting pretty late, probably close to midnight, I'd say. It was getting cold, too. Not just the late October chill of the foothills we lived on. The house was getting real cold. At first, my mom just asked my dad to turn up the thermostat, but after a couple of minutes of the furnace running and the house not warming up, he realized he'd need to go check the furnace downstairs. He grabbed a lighter and headed down there. A minute later, we heard him shouting out for us. "Hey, you gotta come see this!" He said it with something that sounded like part excitement, part nervousness in his voice. We got down there and saw him shining a flashlight into the furnace. Peering in, we noticed the pilot light was indeed out, and then we saw the reason. A dead bird, about the size of my palm or so. It had flown into the furnace from outside and put the flame out, so it was leaking gas into the house. This is a story that my father has told me many times over the years. My dad is a logger, specifically one who operates a tree saw. That's basically a giant machine that's capable of cutting down massive trees and slicing them to specified lengths. This means he spends a lot of time alone out in the deep woods. The way my dad's logging crew was set up is that he would be told where he was supposed to cut down trees. Then he would go and do that. He'd be paid based on the amount of trees he cut, and not on how long it took him. This meant my dad used to work 16 to 20-hour days constantly to get done as quick as possible. Then the rest of the crew would come and clean up the trees and ship them off to the mill. He used to work around 50% of the time alone. The rest of the time was with another tree saw operator named Renee. They would use radios to communicate back and forth when they were working together. Sorry for all that backstory. Now on for the start of the real story. My dad and Renee were put on a new job site, and were about 10 days in. Everything so far was going as planned. Unfortunately, they were constantly picking up weird chatter over their radios. It was such poor quality that no words could be made out, and whatever radio channel they changed to, it always followed them. As they progressed through the job and went farther up the mountain, the words from the radio slowly became more and more audible. Both of them agreed, based on small parts of conversations they could hear, that something was clearly weird here. On their way up as well, they'd started finding weird containers all over the place, and signs that people had been here. People should not have been here. This was a 2.5-hour drive up a mountain. They had to spend 3 weeks clearing out the road just so their trucks and equipment could make it up. Now, they came to the realization that they were in a very secluded area with people who should absolutely not be there. The worst part is they weren't scheduled to leave for another week. They would only leave to refuel the fuel truck with gasoline for the machines. They would buy supplies and sleep in campers. One day, Renee stumbled across a tent and called my dad over. They started to investigate and found one lone sleeping bag and a duffel bag. As they decided to investigate the duffel bag, they found many pairs of children's underwear inside and what appeared to be a rape kit. Rope, duct tape, sketched images of children being molested, and photographs of children that appeared unaware they were being pictured. They also found a small amount of food, which included canned goods and an apple. This proved the tent had been occupied recently, because there was no mold or discoloring on the apple. Now, they knew they were on the mountain alone, with at best case scenario a really fucked up individual. Renee instantly wanted to get out of there, but my dad, being the hardest working person I've ever met, insisted that they needed to finish the job, then they could get out. From that point on, they decided not to talk over the radio except in cases of emergency, to see if they could make out more of what these people were saying. They were now in close enough range of whoever had been talking over the radio to overhear conversations between two men about collecting water and wood for the fire. Nothing abnormal, except for the fact that these guys were out here way in the mountains, and that tent had undoubtedly been theirs. At the end of the workday, my dad overheard them on the radio talking about one of them collecting brush for a fire. My dad hopped on the radio at this point and attempted to communicate them about what the fuck they were doing. I believe he said something along the lines of, "Who are you and what are you doing here? You're not supposed to be here." After this, conversation abruptly stopped and they never picked up. That night, Renee woke my dad up and whispered for him to get his gun. Someone was outside. My dad told me the first thing he heard when he woke up was the quiet shuffling of footsteps around them. My dad fumbled for his gun, only to find it and realize he didn't have it loaded. He had little clue as to where his rounds were, and Renee had nothing to defend themselves. The thought of calling the police was absurd for multiple reasons. They began to hear a jiggle on the doorknob, and then it opened. The camper was far enough off the ground to where you had to jump in, and there was no ladder or footstool. It stayed open, and neither my dad nor Renee could bring themselves to move. They started to hear scratching right outside the door though. After 4 minutes of this scratching, my dad could no longer take it and nodded at Renee. He got up and walked toward the camper door. The second he reached it, he was met with intense pain across his right eye all the way to his left cheek. He had been cut. He fell out of the camper, hitting the ground hard. A man with a knife hopped on top of him. Soon he was also being kicked in the head by a man behind him. Renee leapt out of the trailer and managed to sucker punch the man off my dad. My dad got up and realized the second man without the knife was now running away. The man with the knife was scrambling away from Renee and started running alongside his accomplice. My dad and Renee hopped into the truck and drove to the nearest hospital to treat my dad's cuts and later report the events to the police. They both quit their jobs. 2 weeks later, as the rest of the logging crew was finishing up the job, one of them was found gagged, bound, and murdered, then thrown into a ditch. No one was ever found guilty of these crimes. To this day, my dad can hardly see out of his right eye, and it's very disfigured. He suffers PTSD from these events and hasn't had a good night of sleep since. Rainy night in the era before cell phones existed. I was 18 and walking a very long way home from work. I foolishly accepted a ride home from a strange man. You know, small town girl living in her lonely world, and I had just gotten off a double shift. The man was elderly and acted genuinely concerned for me. I saw a Bible in the back seat as well. Probably safe, right? The car was quite old and somewhat broken down. He even had to get out and open the door for me. It took him a while, as he seemed to have trouble walking with his bum leg. He told me the passenger door wouldn't open from the inside. Immediately, I felt weird about this, but years of nice girl training told me, he's gone through so much trouble. I can't say no now. We chatted for a while, and he politely complimented my uniform, my hair, and told me I looked quite a bit like his late wife, that her spirit must have led him to help me get home. It sounded quite sweet at first. The conversation turned to if I was still in school, what my hobbies were like, and gradually turned to whether or not I was on my period. That was quite rude, but he acted like it was going to be the punchline of a joke or something. I laughingly asked him why he would want to know this. The man looked me dead in the eyes and said very calmly, "Because if you're fertile, we should start trying for a family right away." Oh shit. He said that God had kept him lonely for so many years now, but because I looked so much like his late wife, it was clear I was meant to be his. Now he could start his life over and finally have lots of children like his wife was never able to do. He grabbed my hand firmly and kissed it, then whispered into my ear, "I can't wait to show you to our new bed." Still trying to keep the conversation light and joking, I told him he would need to meet my father to ask his blessing before having his way with me. That's what a godly man would do after all. The man wholeheartedly agreed, even acted offended I thought anything otherwise. We got to the street where I had previously told him I lived. He asked which house was my parents'. I gave him a fake house number, far away from my own, and had him drop me off there. He wanted to come inside right away. I told him I needed to let my parents know about God sending me a husband before he could meet them. It could take a few days though, so come back tomorrow. He told me he'd give me a few minutes, but then we'd need to be on our way. I told him to drive around the block so I could at least have time to pack my clothes. He nodded and finally opened the car door. I ran to that house's door, waved to him until he drove away, and then sprinted to my real house, where I lived all alone at the time. I double-bolted my door and put the couch in front of it that night. I never did see him again though. And no, I did not call the police, though I wish I did. Instead, I moved in with my boyfriend a few days later and insisted on waiting at work until he could pick me up every night. I went to study abroad for a semester. About 2 weeks in, I got a surprise beautiful bouquet of about a dozen roses, but there was no sender information. I asked my at-the-time boyfriend, only to find out it wasn't from him. Weird. By the way, I met my boyfriend at work. We dated for over a year, and all of our co-workers knew all about it. After I returned from abroad, I met up with a bunch of people for drinks. Friends, acquaintances, including this really shy worker, who happened to work at the same company my boyfriend and I also worked at. I was never really friends with him or anything, but sure, why not? Let's grab a beer. Everything was all fun and games, until during the course of our conversation, he accidentally dropped the name of the college I'd spent my semester at. That was weird. I didn't remember mentioning it to anyone outside my family. Why would a random coworker I barely talked to even know this? Then, something even creepier happened. He confessed he was the one who sent the flowers. He said he knew I was so lonely there. I was not. He said he wanted to get to know me more. Obviously, I freaked out inside. On the outside, though, I kept on nodding and smiling. I quickly excused myself to the bathroom and texted a friend, asking him to call me in 5 minutes and pretend it was something urgent. Make it seem like I had to leave the bar. After getting that fake call, I apologized to the guy many times and said I had to leave now. I paid quickly and rushed out, only to notice that instead of staying there, the boy had followed me. I jumped into a cab and yelled at the cabbie to go right now. At first, he didn't believe me, until the boy ran over and began to slam on the window. Finally, the cabbie figured out I was being serious. The boy kept on calling me that entire night. I didn't dare to answer the phone. In all his voicemails, he threatened me and called me an ungrateful whore. Thankfully, though, he eventually did stop calling. There I was, sitting alone in my car at the local duck pond, eating my lunch and reading a book like usual. Normally, I kept my windows up to prevent situations like this from happening, but when I first arrived, no one was around. It was very hot outside, so I'd rolled them all the way down. I had been going to that particular pond for lunch almost every day for the past 2 years, and had never felt uncomfortable. Surely, today would not be any different. Well, I had just opened up my lunch and taken a single bite when this elderly man in a red Jeep rolled up alongside me. He got out and roamed around the park a bit before walking over to me and starting a conversation. Of course, I was not going to be rude to the man from the start. That park was part of a tourist area, and I figured he was probably either just lost and looking for directions, or more likely a retired and very lonely old man. I decided to indulge him for a bit. I told him I was in school at the local community college, and where I worked as well during casual conversation. He asked me what I did there, and I said I was an HVAC apprentice. Wow, I used to work on HVAC stuff in the military. I thought that was really cool. I figured that someone with as much experience as that could give me some pretty useful tips for my career. If I remember correctly, he did tell me some things that would have been useful. But the conversation quickly became predatory after that. He asked me how old I was. I was 18. He told me he was 52. This guy looked like he was in his 90s at the very youngest. But whatever, I figured. A lot of military people get real heavy into drugs and alcohol, so maybe that had done a number on him. Then he asked if I had a boyfriend. Nope. He said he had a wife he'd cheated on a lot and a couple of kids who didn't like him. That was kind of a deep thing to admit to a stranger, but if he was comfortable sharing, well, that's on him, I guess. He kept going on and on about how much he loved women, and how he just couldn't keep to himself when he cheated on his wife. Then he asked if I was a virgin. By this point, I was already picking up on the bad vibes from this guy. Really, no matter what I told him was going to be a lose-lose situation. I was afraid that if I told him I wasn't a virgin, he'd think I was loose or something and do whatever he wanted to me. I went with virgin, hoping that would imply I was a prude and he'd give up on me. Instead, he got off on what seemed to be the thought of seducing a virgin 18-year-old. I tried multiple times to get him to go away, but he just kept bringing it back up. If I masturbated, watched porn, ever wanted to have sex, all of which I said no to. I figured he was from an older generation that thought you had to convince women to go out with you. That once he realized I was serious, he would just give up. No one wants to be a rapist, right? I was already uncomfortable with this guy, but then the threats started. Just over and over again, very firmly. I knew he wasn't going to give me a choice in the matter. I realized now I was completely alone in the park with this guy as well. No security cameras anywhere. No one knew I went to the pond for lunch every day. You might be asking yourself why I didn't just turn on my car and leave. Well, I had placed my keys into the passenger seat to relax. I was afraid that by the time I reached the keys and put them in the ignition, that this old guy would have already climbed in through the window and would be fighting me for control of the vehicle. I continued with polite conversation, pretending to be unaware of his motives. I just had to wait for the right moment. For him to look away, to let his guard down, so I could grab my keys and get out of there. Luckily for me, a school bus full of children came just as I thought he was going to reach in and try and fight me tooth and nail. As soon as he saw them arrive, he looked really freaked out, then kind of disappointed, like he knew he'd just lost his prized catch. There were too many witnesses now, too many people who might intervene. Surely he would get double jail time for doing such things around a bus full of kids. He gave me a sort of hostile look, then said he would look for me again in the park. He hopped in his red Jeep and took off. If worse came to worse, I think I could have taken him in a fight. He might have been ex-military, but he also looked like he came from hell. A strong breeze might break this guy's bones. I'm glad I didn't have to find out, though. I believe it was his intention to go out that day and find someone like me to rape. Maybe he even had a weapon on him. Needless to say, I avoided that park for the next month or two, and once I did return, I was really paranoid I might see him again. Honestly, be careful how much information you reveal about yourself to strangers. In the course of 45 minutes, I had unknowingly given this guy enough information to track me down if he really wanted to. Which school I went to, the program I was in, where I worked, my name, my age. He could have even written down my license plate number if he wanted. This is gonna be long, but it is worth it, I promise. I was working at a sports bar in the morning when a big dirty fella sat down in my section. He had shoulder-length wild hair and dirty torn clothing. You know, typical loony garb. I'm a good waitress though, and I didn't plan on treating him any different than anybody else. I greeted him happily and was instantly hit with the smell of garbage. I grew up neglected and abused. This is important for a few reasons, some of which will come into play later. 1. I know what it's like to be judged, so I empathize and overcompensate when I deal with someone I think has also wrongfully been judged. 2. My parents were creepy hoarders, so the smell of garbage gave me anxiety attacks. And 3. Because of the abuse and some other traumas, I have severe PTSD. This means I was always on high alert and hypersensitive to my surroundings and possible threats. Even though the smell of this man was skyrocketing my anxiety, I tried to treat him well. I figured he must be down on his luck. He came in on all-you-can-eat taco bar day and stayed for about 5 hours. I figured he must have not eaten much lately, which struck a personal chord with me. Our parents didn't really feed us when we were kids, and often we went days without any food. I felt so sorry for him, so I went above and beyond when serving him. Obviously, he appreciated it quite a bit. He left, and nothing seemed unusual. When he returned the next week, he specifically requested me. This time, he'd brought some emails he printed out between him and his ex, and asked me if I could read them and explain some of the things his ex had said, since I was a girl and would probably understand more. I told him I would do it when I wasn't working. I really had no intention of doing so, though. I took them and shoved them somewhere random in my purse. From a glimpse, though, I could see his name seemed to be Steve. He later asked what days and shifts I work, and I lied through my teeth. He began to ask other personal questions, too. I was all too used to this. I waited tables for 8 years at this point, and dealt with my fair share of creepers. Because of this, I had this whole entire fabricated life story on deck designed to deter any funny business. I remembered that the only true thing I ever told him was that my sister worked at a Subway, and I accidentally mentioned her name as well. I remember vividly because I had a very strong gut feeling afterward that I shouldn't have said that. I wish I had listened to that feeling. A week later, during one of my night shifts, Steve came in and he was pissed. He demanded to know why I wasn't working when I said I was. I said I'd traded a lot of shifts recently. He got in super close and told me I'd better be here next time. Then he left in an angry storm. The cook told me he had seen that guy sleeping in his car in the parking lot that morning. He had seen that same car parked in the lot several times at night as well. He knew it was the same one because it was absolutely filled with trash. Steve came back in after last call and told me he wanted to place an order. I told him it was too late, so he went to the bathroom. I watched and waited for him to leave, but he never did. At this point, I felt a panic attack building. I told the bartender what was going on, and he and the bouncer found the man standing on the toilet in the stall. They dragged him out and told him he could never come back. I told my boyfriend as well, so when he picked me up, he brought 2 friends with him. I even discreetly hid my face and disguised myself as I left, checking the mirrors to make sure we weren't being followed. Steve never came back after, and I ended up quitting shortly after anyway. Eventually, my boyfriend and I broke up. I kept our apartment though and had my sister move in. A few months later, things took a turn for the worst. I had started dating my now girlfriend, who was from a small town. She wanted to take a weekend trip back home. When we got back, one of the window panes was busted in. I asked my sister what had happened. She hadn't even noticed. She hadn't left the house all weekend, and she hadn't heard glass breaking or anything suspicious during that time. Because of this, it did not feel like a break-in attempt. The more we thought about it, the scarier it became. 1, we were dead broke. There's nothing you could get any money from inside. It was evident no matter what window you looked in from. 2, the window pane was pried out, not busted in, meaning they knew someone was home and they hadn't wanted to be heard. And 3, it was the only night in over a year that I had actually left town. I hadn't shared it on Facebook or told any friends or anything. Neither my sister or I have cars either, so you couldn't look in the driveway and just see who was home. The next night, we heard the neighbors' dogs barking and growling, and we heard footsteps in the yard as well. I grabbed our gun, went to the living room next to the yard, and listened real hard. I tried to think to myself, is this 2 feet or 4? An animal, perhaps. The second I realized it was someone bipedal, I started flipping the lights on and off rhythmically to make the person think we were signaling our neighbor. That made them take off running. Obviously, this was sign for it had not been a break-in attempt. You don't return to the very same house you failed to break into the day before. My sister and I got tasers and wasp spray. I didn't have a concealed carry, and my sister didn't want to touch a gun. My sister was now armed, so that weekend my girlfriend and I decided to go out. We got into a stupid fight that night though. When she dropped me off, I threw $20 into her car and said something snarky, like, "Here's half my tab." Then I rushed back inside. When she was a few blocks away, she texted she was going to come give it back, but I told her not to. She knocked, but I didn't answer because I was mad at her. I heard footsteps come up to my bedroom window. I waited for her to knock on the window so I could yell that I told her not to come by, but instead, the person at my window just walked off. She texted the next day to say she had tucked the $20 into the screen door. I got up to grab it only to see there was nothing there. I told her it wasn't there and asked if maybe it could have fallen out. Wasn't possible. I then asked why she'd walked by my window, only for her to say she had never done that. This meant whoever saw her leave the money had to be 50 or feet less from the door. It had only been 3 minutes tops from when she dropped it off to when I checked. The only place they could have been in was our backyard. This means whoever walked up to my window knew my girlfriend was there to see me and knew which room was mine. A week later, we started to hear the steps in the yard again. I did the same routine. Grabbed the gun, stood in the living room, started with the lights. Then I had an idea. This person needed to think they could be seen, so I started to flip the switch every time I heard a step. Once they noticed, they started running. I ran to look out the peephole to see a big fella with wild hair running down the alley. Even though I hadn't managed to get a great look, it looked like Steve. I started looking for the emails he'd given me. Like I said, I was always on high alert, and now he'd raised a concern. The second I noticed his full name was on those emails, I decided this was going to be useful information. I got his last name and searched his public record. Then I pulled up his most recent mugshot. I asked my sister if she had seen the man before, and her face went ghost white. She had. She even remembered his garbage-like smell. He'd come into her job multiple times. Every time he came in and asked her many questions. She said she'd never forget the creepy, menacing smile he plastered on his face the second she told him her full name, the feeling of pure fear it gave her. She rode her bike to and from work at this time, so I'm betting he followed her home. One thing became painfully clear now. He didn't hurt my girlfriend when she'd left the money. He didn't touch my sister when she rode her bike home or was home alone. This was all about me. The second she told me this, I called the cops right away. I gave them the emails and told them everything I knew, down to the name of the cook I knew could describe his car. They found it within the week. It was abandoned by the side of a lake. It was full of trash, a few personal belongings, and pages of his crazy thoughts and intentions. There were thousands of pages about me, what he thought he knew about me, my sister, a checklist of all the subways he'd checked just to find her, what he learned from her, the layout of our house, my girlfriend's info. Most fucked up, his very sexually charged plan to kidnap me, keep me alive, and cut me up and eat me piece by piece. His plan had been to break in, murder my sister, wait for me to come home, then cut off a piece of me each day and make me watch while he ate it and jerked off. In less than 24 hours, the police had found his body in the lake. I had PTSD before this happened. So did my sister. This event made it so much worse for us. My sister can't work either now. We're both in the disability process. I decided this was a story worth telling. I'll never get over it if I keep avoiding it. And maybe, hopefully, this will help save someone else's life. Thanks for listening. I was about 13 or 14 years old, and I was babysitting 2 boys for some church members. I had done this before, and the kids loved me a lot. The parents were also very comfortable with me. This was a night where they were going to be gone pretty much until about 2:30 in the morning. I was doing this for free that day because they were going to do something church-related, and that's just kind of how I rolled. Anyway, the house they lived in was an apartment complex. You know, one of those small ones that had 2 floors and 4 places in each spot. They were on the bottom floor with 2 bedrooms on either side of the apartment, the kitchen on the left and the living room on the right, with a sliding glass door to a small patio and a public bathroom next to the front door. It was around 1:30 or so, and I knew they would be arriving back home soon. The kids were knocked out, obviously after practically begging and 3 bedtime stories. I had finished my homework now. They didn't have cable. They only had a couple of DVDs and VHSs to watch. I grabbed Land Before Time to make the night go by quicker. I was already very tired and had nodded off a couple of times. Around 2 in the morning though, I could hear a knocking on the front door. Knowing the parents had a key with them, I did nothing but sit there in the dark with the TV glowing on my face. Being a paranoid person who watches and reads enough horror already, I snatched up the baseball bat that was next to the couch. What I heard next will haunt me forever. I heard a small voice calling out, almost like a young woman's. Oh dear, that won't help you at all. My heart stopped. I realized the patio door did not have the blinds shut. My eyes shifted slowly to the door, only to see someone out on the patio, staring inside. I couldn't make out anything other than they were very short and wide. I screamed and ran to the kids' room. Thankfully, they were still asleep. Sadly, this was before I had a cell phone, and there were no cordless phones at the time. I pushed the dresser in front of the door and stared at the one window of the room. It suddenly became dark as a shadow loomed over the window. The knocking started again, and the woman's voice called out once more. Come on, dearie. I won't hurt you. Just come out now. The window was being knocked so hard, I was afraid it would break. The kids woke up now. They were screaming and scared. I was a big girl. At the time, I could even lift my own weight. Knowing I had the responsibility of 2 kids' lives with me though, I was very vulnerable and afraid. Within 2 seconds, I heard the father screaming out, Hey, who the hell are you? The person ran off. The front door opened, and there was a harsh knocking on the kids' bedroom door. Thankfully, it was the parents. After I let them in and put the dresser back, I explained what had happened, and they called the police. When they arrived, they obviously found nothing. The bushes that hide the patio were cut up though, and ripped open to get through. I babysat for them once more after that, but moved away 5 months later, and never babysat anyone ever again. To this day, I know the woman was long gone, but every time I hear a knock at the door, a chill runs through me. What is up guys, Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with, and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.